There's a mansion that still stands in the countryside, just far enough from the city to feel exclusive, just close enough to be seen. Gothic spires pierce the sky. Marble staircases sweep through silent halls. Gilded details catch the light in rooms where no one lives. It's one of the most expensive private homes ever built in America during the Gilded Age, a palace designed to rival European aristocracy, constructed with a fortune earned in steel and railroads, adorned with treasures imported from demolished estates across the Atlantic. From the outside, it looks like a monument to success. From the inside, it was always a trap. Because this mansion wasn't built for family. It was built to impress people who would never truly accept the family inside it. And in trying to earn that acceptance, the family who built this palace lost everything that money was supposed to protect. Within these walls, children were raised as performances rather than people. A daughter was crushed by expectations she could never meet. A son fled and never returned. A marriage disintegrated under the weight of maintaining appearances. And the patriarch, the man who built this monument to prove his worth, died having earned the admiration of society, but lost the love of everyone who mattered. This mansion survived. The family did not. Generations later, visitors walk through these halls and marvel at the chandeliers, the imported marble, the hand-carved woodwork that cost more than most Americans earned in a lifetime. But they don't see what's missing. They don't feel the pressure that turned elegance into suffocation. They don't understand that every room was designed not for living, but for being judged. And they don't realize that this house didn't just witness a family's collapse. It caused it. Tonight, we reveal the true story behind the mansion that was never meant to be a home. The story of a family who tried to buy belonging with architecture, who discovered that acceptance from high society came at a cost far higher than construction bills, who learned that some houses don't shelter families, they replace them.
This is not a story about wealth.
This is a story about the brutal price of trying to impress people who were never going to love you anyway. This is the story of the house that destroyed a family. And it begins not with construction but with shame. America's Gilded Age is in full swing, and the country is minting millionaires faster than any civilization in history. Railroads are slicing across the continent. Steel mills are turning iron into empires. Oil is gushing from Pennsylvania fields. Factories are multiplying like weeds. And at the center of it all, driving the engines, signing the contracts, accumulating wealth at a pace that makes European aristocrats nervous, are men like him. We'll call him the patriarch.
Self-made.
Ruthless when necessary. Brilliant with numbers. He'd started with nothing and built a fortune in railroads and steel, the kind of fortune that could buy estates, import art, finance political campaigns, and reshape entire cities. But there was one thing his money couldn't buy: respect. Not the kind that comes from fear or obligation. The kind that comes from acceptance. Because in Gilded Age America, there were two kinds of wealth, and everyone knew the difference. Old money was quiet, inherited, tied to names that had been important for generations. Families like the Astors, the Vanderbilts before they clawed their way up, the Knickerbocker elite who controlled New York society with invitations and exclusions. New money was loud, recent, stained with the sweat and blood of how it was actually made. And no matter how many millions the patriarch accumulated, no matter how many railroads he controlled or steel contracts he signed, he was still new money, which meant he was still an outsider. The private clubs didn't invite him. The society matrons didn't include his wife in their circles. His daughters weren't invited to the right debutante balls. His name appeared in business newspapers, but never in society pages. He could buy anything except the one thing he wanted most: belonging. And that rejection burned. Not because he needed these people, but because their refusal to acknowledge him felt like proof that no matter how high he climbed, he would always be seen as lesser. So he made a decision. If society wouldn't open their doors to him, he would build a door so grand, so impossible to ignore, that they would have no choice but to come to him. He would build a mansion. Not just any mansion. A palace that would rival anything Europe had to offer. A monument so magnificent that high society would be forced to acknowledge his arrival, not as a supplicant begging for acceptance, but as an equal demanding recognition. The location was chosen carefully. Not in the city, where he'd be competing directly with established families, but just outside, close enough to be visible from the carriage roads, far enough to feel exclusive, remote enough to seem like old money even though the fortune was brand new. He hired the finest architects available, men trained in Europe, who understood that in the Gilded Age, architecture was a language of power. Every detail was planned with obsessive precision. The facade would be Gothic Revival, referencing medieval European nobility. The materials would be the finest available: marble from Italy, woodwork from Germany, stained glass from France. The ballroom would accommodate 300 guests. The dining room would seat 50. The library would hold 10,000 volumes, most of which would never be read, but all of which would look impressive. 75 rooms spread across 4 floors. Servants' quarters hidden in the wings. A conservatory filled with plants that couldn't survive local winters without constant care. Gardens designed by landscape architects who'd worked on European estates. The budget was effectively unlimited. Because this wasn't about building a home. This was about building proof. Proof that he had arrived. Proof that his wealth was legitimate. Proof that he deserved to be included in circles that had spent decades excluding him. Construction took 3 years. During that time, society watched. Newspapers covered the progress. Rumors circulated about the cost. Some said $2 million, others claimed 5. A few whispered it was closer to 10. All were probably underestimates. And as the mansion rose from the carefully landscaped grounds, as the Gothic spires reached toward the sky, as the marble walls gleamed in the sunlight, the patriarch felt vindication building alongside the structure. This would force them to see him. This would make them acknowledge what he'd accomplished. This would finally prove that he belonged. But there was a problem he didn't recognize until it was too late. The mansion wasn't designed around the family. It was designed around observation. Every room existed to be judged. The ballroom was built to host society, not family gatherings. The dining room was built to impress guests, not feed children comfortably. The bedrooms were built to showcase luxury, not provide warmth. The library was built to look impressive, not encourage reading. Even the private family spaces felt performative, as if the walls themselves were watching, evaluating, measuring every moment against the standards of people who would never actually live there. The house was a stage, and the family was cast as actors in a play they hadn't auditioned for. When they finally moved in, 1876, the centennial of American independence, a symbolic choice the patriarch made deliberately. The house was flawless. Every surface polished. Every chandelier gleaming. Every room arranged to perfection. But walking through those halls for the first time, the patriarch's wife felt something she couldn't quite name. The rooms were too large. The ceilings too high. The silence too complete. It didn't feel like coming home. It felt like moving into a museum. The children, 2 daughters, 1 son, ran through the halls that first day, their voices echoing off marble floors and vaulted ceilings. But within weeks, they'd learned to move quietly, because the house demanded it. Staff appeared and disappeared like ghosts, maintaining the illusion of effortless elegance. Meals were served in the formal dining room, even when it was just the family, because the informal dining room still felt too grand for casual use. Conversations were careful, measured, aware that every word seemed to carry more weight in rooms this large. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the family began to change. Not because they wanted to, but because the house demanded it. They became curators of an image rather than inhabitants of a home. They learned to move through space as if always on display. They discovered that vulnerability felt dangerous in rooms designed to project strength. The patriarch had built his monument. Society noticed. Invitations began arriving, first out of curiosity, then obligation, eventually tradition. High society came to the mansion for balls, dinners, garden parties. They marveled at the architecture. They complimented the host. They attended events that made the society pages. And the patriarch finally felt like he'd won. But what he didn't realize, what he couldn't see because he was too focused on external validation, was that the house had already begun its work.
Not on society.
On his family. Because while he was winning acceptance from people who would never truly care about him, he was losing the people who already did. The mansion was perfect. The family was fracturing. And the cost of belonging was about to come due. The mansion's golden years lasted exactly 7 years. From 1876 to 1883, the house functioned exactly as the patriarch had envisioned. Society came. Not warmly. High society never does anything warmly, but they came. The spring galas became annual fixtures on the social calendar. The summer garden parties drew carriages from estates 50 miles away. The winter balls lit up the countryside like a palace transplanted from Europe. Politicians attended, seeking donations and connections. Bankers came, negotiating deals over brandy in the library. Society matrons arrived, evaluating the family with the cold precision of appraisers assessing furniture. And for the patriarch, each event felt like validation. Proof that the house had worked. Proof that he'd finally forced his way into circles that had spent decades excluding him. But what he saw as triumph, his family experienced as performance. Because inside the mansion, nothing was allowed to be real. The eldest daughter, we'll call her Helena, learned this lesson first. At 17, she was being groomed for society in the way Gilded Age daughters were, not as individuals, but as investments. Her education wasn't about knowledge, it was about accomplishment. She learned French not to read literature, but to speak it at dinner parties. She learned piano not to enjoy music, but to perform for guests. She learned etiquette not for comfort, but for evaluation. Every aspect of her life was calibrated toward a single goal, a strategic marriage that would cement the family's social position. She had opinions, she always had, but learned quickly that the mansion wasn't a place where daughters expressed them. She had interests, books mostly, and a fascination with botany that no one encouraged, but those were indulged only in private, in her bedroom, in moments stolen between the endless preparation for being seen. Because at the mansion, Helena wasn't a person. She was a presentation. Her mother, the matriarch, understood this better than anyone. She'd married the patriarch when he was rising but not yet arrived, when his fortune was growing but his reputation was still forming. She'd been beautiful once, socially adept, capable of navigating the complex hierarchies of Gilded Age society. But 20 years of marriage had transformed her from wife into manager. Her job wasn't to be happy. It was to ensure the family's social machinery functioned flawlessly. She oversaw every detail of every event, the guest lists, the menus, the floral arrangements, the seating charts that required the diplomatic skills of an ambassador. She managed the household staff, 32 people whose sole purpose was maintaining the illusion that this level of perfection happened effortlessly. She coached her daughters on posture, conversation, the delicate art of being interesting enough to be remembered, but not so interesting as to be threatening. And she did all of this while slowly disappearing, not physically, but emotionally. Staff who'd worked at the mansion for years described her as increasingly distant, present but not engaged, managing rather than living. One housekeeper would later recall, she moved through the house like she was checking items off a list. I never once saw her sit down in a room just to enjoy it. Every space was a project. Every moment was preparation for the next event. The matriarch had become what the mansion demanded, flawless, functional, and fundamentally hollow. The son, the only male heir, the one who was supposed to inherit everything, dealt with the pressure differently. He rebelled. Not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently, quietly, in ways that drove the patriarch to fury. He refused to take interest in the railroad business. He spent money recklessly, not on investments, but on horses, travel, friends his father considered worthless. He missed social events, claiming illness or prior commitments. He brought inappropriate guests to the mansion, artists, musicians, people whose wealth came from talent rather than inheritance. The patriarch saw this as betrayal. The son saw it as survival. Because he'd recognized something his father refused to acknowledge. The mansion was eating them alive. And the only way to escape was to refuse to perform. But rebellion required leaving. And leaving required money his father controlled. So the son stayed, trapped not by walls, but by inheritance, performing just enough to maintain access to the fortune while doing everything possible to avoid becoming his father. Meanwhile, the events continued. Spring 1879, a garden party for 200 guests. Helena played piano. The matriarch supervised every detail. The patriarch gave a speech about American progress. Society applauded. Behind closed doors, Helena had cried for an hour before the event, begging to be excused, claiming a headache. Her mother told her, "You'll learn that what you want doesn't matter. Only what's necessary." Winter 1880, a ball celebrating the family's 10th year in the mansion. 300 guests. An orchestra imported from New York. Dancing until 2 in the morning. The son got drunk in the library and told a banker's daughter that the mansion was a beautiful prison where everyone pretends they chose to be locked up. The comment reached his father by breakfast. They didn't speak for 3 months. Summer 1881. A luncheon for society matrons. The matriarch orchestrated it flawlessly. Every detail perfect. Every guest impressed. Afterward, a maid found her sitting alone in the conservatory, staring at nothing, tears running silently down her face. When the maid asked if she needed help, the matriarch said, "I'm fine. I was just trying to remember what it felt like before all of this mattered so much." The maid was told by the head housekeeper to forget the conversation. She never did, because what she'd witnessed wasn't a breakdown. It was a moment of clarity, quickly buried, but briefly visible, that the mansion had transformed the matriarch from a woman into a mechanism. By 1882, the pattern was undeniable. The more successful the events, the more hollow the family became. They ate meals together in the formal dining room, but conversation was careful, calculated, drained of anything real. They occupied the same house, but lived in separate emotional universes. The patriarch measured success by society's attendance. The matriarch measured success by the absence of scandal. Helena measured success by how many hours she could spend alone in her room, reading books that had nothing to do with being marriageable. The son measured success by how long he could avoid being in the mansion at all. And slowly, room by room, the house filled with a silence that had nothing to do with peace. Staff noticed it first. The way conversations stopped when they entered rooms. The way family members chose opposite wings of the house to spend their time. The way the patriarch ate breakfast alone, reading newspapers, while the rest of the family stayed in their rooms. The way Helena sat at her piano, practicing the same pieces over and over, not because she needed to but because it gave her something to do that looked productive. The way the matriarch walked the halls at night, checking that everything was in place, that nothing had been disturbed, that the mansion remained perfect even when no one was watching. One butler, who'd worked at the mansion since its opening, would later tell his own family. Rich people's houses are supposed to be loud. Children running, dogs barking, life happening. That house was like a museum. Beautiful, expensive, and completely dead inside. But the patriarch didn't see it. Or refused to. Because from his perspective, the mansion was working perfectly. Society accepted him now. Business deals happened in his library. His name appeared in society columns alongside families that had ignored him for decades. He'd won. And if that victory required his wife to become a manager, his daughter to become a performance, his son to become a disappointment, well, that was simply the cost of success. What he didn't realize, what he couldn't see because he was too focused on external validation, was that acceptance from people who didn't love him was no substitute for love from people who once did. The mansion had given him everything he'd built it for, and taken everything he'd built it with. By 1883, the house was at its peak. And the family was already gone, not physically, but in every way that actually mattered. The trap had closed, and no one inside had even noticed the door locking behind them. Spring 1884. Helena turned 21 in a mansion that felt smaller every year despite containing 75 rooms. The matriarch organized a birthday celebration, not for Helena, but for the society matrons who needed to see that the family's eldest daughter was marriageable, accomplished, and available. 60 guests attended. Helena smiled through every conversation. She played Chopin flawlessly. She discussed literature in French with a diplomat's wife. She laughed at jokes that weren't funny. And afterward, alone in her room, she stared at her reflection in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman looking back. The pressure had been building for years, slow, incremental, like water filling a sealed room. But that night, something inside her finally cracked. Not violently, not dramatically, just a quiet internal collapse that no one noticed because she'd learned too well how to hide it. The next morning, she told her mother she didn't want to marry. The matriarch's response was immediate and absolute. "What you want stopped mattering the day your father built this house." It wasn't cruelty. It was fact. Because in the world the mansion had created, Helena had never been a daughter with agency. She'd been an asset with a purpose. And that purpose was a strategic marriage. Within 3 months, the arrangement was made. The groom was the second son of an old money family, respectable lineage, diminished fortune, desperate for an infusion of new money to maintain their crumbling estate. It was the perfect exchange, his name for her father's wealth. Helena met him twice before the engagement was announced. She didn't love him. She didn't even particularly like him. But love, her mother explained, was a luxury that women like them couldn't afford. "You'll learn to be content," the matriarch said. I did. And that, more than anything, was what broke Helena completely. Because she finally understood. Her mother hadn't escaped the trap. She'd just stopped struggling against it. The wedding was scheduled for October 1884. It would be the social event of the season, 300 guests, imported flowers, a dress that cost more than most Americans earned in 5 years. But as the date approached, Helena began disappearing. Not physically, but emotionally. Staff noticed her becoming quieter, slower, distant in a way that felt different from her usual withdrawn nature. She stopped reading. She stopped playing piano. She spent hours staring out windows at gardens she no longer walked through. One maid found her standing in the ballroom at 3 a.m, still in her nightgown, staring at the chandeliers. When asked if she was all right, Helena said, "I was trying to remember if I was ever happy here. I can't. Isn't that strange? 7 years in this house, and I can't remember a single moment of actual happiness." The maid reported it to the matriarch. The matriarch told her to forget the conversation and watch Helena more carefully. 2 weeks before the wedding, Helena stopped eating. Not obviously. Not enough to cause immediate alarm. Just slowly reducing portions, claiming fullness, pushing food around her plate during the formal dinners she was still required to attend. The matriarch noticed, but said nothing. Thin brides photographed better. By the wedding day, Helena looked ethereal. Guests whispered about how beautiful she was, pale, delicate, almost ghost-like in her elaborate dress. No one mentioned that she looked like she was already mourning. The ceremony was flawless. The reception was magnificent. And that night, Helena left the mansion for her new husband's estate. She never returned. Not because she was forbidden, but because the thought of walking back through those doors, even as a visitor, was more than she could bear. She would live another 33 years. But staff from her new household would later describe her as a woman who'd survived something terrible but could never explain what. She had 2 children she rarely held. She hosted dinners she never enjoyed. She moved through her life like someone who'd learned to exist without ever actually living. And when she died in 1917, quietly, in her sleep, at 54, her daughter found a letter hidden in her desk drawer. It was addressed to no one, dated October 1884, and it contained a single line. "The house took everything I was supposed to become and left only what I was supposed to be." She'd written it the night before her wedding, and carried it with her for 33 years. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, the son's rebellion reached its breaking point. Throughout 1885 and 1886, his behavior became increasingly erratic, not dangerous, but deliberately provocative. He brought anarchists to dinner. He funded labor organizers whose strikes disrupted his father's railroads. He published an anonymous essay in a progressive newspaper criticizing Gilded Age excess, an essay his father immediately recognized as written by someone with intimate knowledge of their world. The patriarch tried threats. Cut off the inheritance. The son called his bluff. Then I'll write a book about this family. See how society feels about you when they know the truth. The patriarch tried negotiation. Take a position in the company, learn the business, prove yourself worthy. The son refused. I'd rather be poor than become you. Finally, in March 1887, the patriarch made a choice. Not out of love or understanding, but out of pragmatism. He paid his son an enormous sum, enough to live comfortably for life, in exchange for a contract. The son would leave, never return, never speak publicly about the family, and never contest the will. The son signed immediately. He left the mansion that afternoon, and never came back. He moved to Europe, Paris, then Rome, then Vienna, funding artists, writing occasional essays under pseudonyms, living quietly and deliberately without ambition. He would outlive everyone in his family. And when asked, late in life, if he regretted abandoning his inheritance, he said, "I didn't abandon an inheritance. I escaped a grave." But the cruelest collapse was saved for the matriarch. Because while Helena left and the son escaped, she remained, managing, maintaining, performing the role she'd spent 2 decades perfecting. But something had broken inside her when Helena married. Not dramatically, she was far too controlled for that. But quietly, irreparably. She began walking the mansion at night, not checking on staff or arrangements, but wandering aimlessly through rooms that suddenly felt too large, too empty, too perfectly preserved. She started dismissing staff without explanation, not many, just 1 or 2 at a time, until the household of 32 became 20, then 15, then 10. She stopped organizing events. When society friends invited her to their homes, she declined. She took meals alone in her sitting room instead of the formal dining room. And slowly, methodically, she began closing off sections of the mansion. First the ballroom, too large for a family that no longer gathered. Then the music room. Helena's piano sat untouched, gathering dust. Then the guest wings no one visited anymore. By 1889, the matriarch and the patriarch were living in opposite wings of a 75-room mansion, seeing each other only at dinner, speaking only when necessary, occupying the same house, but existing in completely separate emotional universes. The patriarch still attended to business, still met with associates in the library, still believed the mansion had been worth it. The matriarch stopped believing anything. One evening in late 1890, the head housekeeper found her sitting in the conservatory, the same spot where, years earlier, a maid had found her crying. She wasn't crying now. She was just sitting in silence, staring at plants that required constant care to survive in a climate they weren't meant for. The housekeeper asked if she needed anything. The matriarch said, "Do you know what's worse than being trapped? Realizing you built your own cage and called it a home." Then she stood, smoothed her dress, and walked back into the mansion. The housekeeper never saw her smile again. By 1891, the pattern was complete. Helena gone, physically present somewhere else, but emotionally destroyed. The son gone, escaped but permanently severed from the family that raised him. The matriarch broken, still managing the mansion but no longer inhabiting herself. The patriarch alone, successful by every external measure, abandoned by everyone who'd once loved him. And the mansion? The mansion endured.
Perfect. Preserved.
Empty, in every way that mattered. Because the house had won. Not through violence or disaster, but through something far more insidious. It had convinced the family that maintaining appearances was more important than maintaining each other. And by the time they realized the cost, there was nothing left to preserve except the building itself. The financial panic that swept through America that year didn't destroy the patriarch's fortune, but it wounded it. Railroad stocks collapsed. Banks failed. Businesses that had seemed invincible 6 months earlier shuttered overnight. The patriarch survived. His wealth was too diversified, his investments too strategic, but the margins narrowed. And for the first time since building the mansion, he had to confront an uncomfortable reality. The house was expensive. Not just to build, that cost had been paid years ago, but to maintain. 75 rooms required constant care, repairs, heating, staff salaries, groundskeeping, the endless small expenditures that accumulated into staggering annual costs. Before, when money flowed freely, those costs had been invisible. Now they were unavoidable. The patriarch began making calculations. Not about whether to keep the house, that was unthinkable, but about how to reduce what it demanded. More staff were dismissed. By 1894, the household that once required 32 people operated with 8. Entire wings were closed, doors locked, furniture covered with sheets, rooms left to gather dust in elegant silence. The gardens, once immaculately maintained, were simplified. Fewer exotic plants, less frequent care, sections allowed to naturalize into something closer to wild. The parties stopped entirely. Not because society had rejected the family, they'd already achieved that acceptance years ago, but because the patriarch no longer saw the point. Helena was gone. The son was gone. The social validation he'd craved felt hollow now that there was no family to share it with. And the matriarch, the woman who'd orchestrated every detail of every event, had stopped caring entirely. By 1895, the mansion had become exactly what it always threatened to be, a monument to absence. The patriarch and matriarch lived in separate wings, maintaining separate schedules, eating separate meals. They would pass each other in hallways and nod politely, like strangers sharing a hotel. Conversations, when they happened, were purely functional, financial matters, household decisions, nothing personal. One of the remaining staff members, a housekeeper who'd worked at the mansion since its opening, would later describe those years as living in a beautiful tomb. You could go days without hearing voices, she said. Just footsteps on marble, doors closing, silence filling every space. The house was maintained perfectly, everything dusted, everything in place, but it felt dead, like we were all just keeping a corpse presentable. The patriarch spent most of his time in the library, managing investments, reading newspapers, corresponding with business associates. He aged rapidly during these years, not from illness, but from something harder to name. The vitality that had driven him to build empires, to construct monuments, to force society's acceptance, had simply evaporated. One evening in 1897, his secretary found him standing at the library window, staring out at the grounds he'd landscaped 20 years earlier. The secretary asked if he needed anything. The patriarch said, without turning, "I built this house to prove something. I can't remember what." Then he returned to his desk and never mentioned it again. But the comment haunted the secretary for the rest of his life, because it revealed what the patriarch had never been able to admit. He'd won everything he'd fought for, and lost everything that mattered. The matriarch's decline was slower but more visible. She stopped leaving her rooms except for meals. She stopped managing the household. The remaining staff operated without direction, maintaining routines that no longer served any purpose. She stopped corresponding with society friends who still occasionally sent invitations. By 1898, she'd become a ghost in her own house, physically present but emotionally absent, moving through spaces without inhabiting them. The housekeeper, who described the mansion as a tomb, tried once to reach her. She brought tea to the matriarch's sitting room and found her staring at a photograph, a family portrait taken in 1878, 2 years after moving into the mansion. The patriarch standing proud. The matriarch smiling. Helena at 14 still hopeful. The son at 12, not yet broken. "We look happy," the matriarch said quietly. "I don't remember if we were." The housekeeper said nothing. "Do you know what I regret most?" the matriarch continued. "Not the parties. Not the performances. But that I convinced myself it mattered. That I told my daughter what she wanted didn't matter. That I let this house tell me who I had to be instead of remembering who I was." She set down the photograph. "The worst part is, I can't even remember who I was before all of this." She died 6 months later. February 1899. Influenza, the doctor said. But the staff knew better. She'd simply stopped fighting to exist in a house that had already consumed everything she'd sacrificed to maintain. The funeral was small, just the patriarch, a few distant relatives, and the remaining staff. Helena didn't attend. She sent a telegram. I cannot return to that house. Please understand. The son didn't respond at all. The patriarch buried his wife in the family plot he'd established on the grounds, a decision that ensured she would remain part of the estate even in death. And then he returned to the mansion. Alone. For the next 4 years, he lived in a house built for a family that no longer existed. He maintained his routines: breakfast in his study, business correspondence in the library, evening walks through halls that echoed with his solitary footsteps. The remaining staff watched him age visibly, not gradually, but in sudden collapses of vitality followed by periods of mechanical functionality. He stopped eating regularly. He stopped sleeping in his bedroom, preferring to doze in the library chair. He stopped attending to his appearance with the precision that had once defined him. And slowly, the mansion itself began to decay around him. Not dramatically. The structure remained sound. The basic maintenance continued. But the edges frayed. Paint faded. Wallpaper peeled slightly at the seams. Carpets wore thin in the pathways he walked daily. The gardens went wild, manicured lawns giving way to something more natural and less controlled. Windows that once gleamed now carried a film of dust that no one bothered to clean weekly. The mansion was still standing, but it was no longer perfect, and in that imperfection, it finally resembled the family that had built it. In early 1903, the patriarch collapsed in the library. A stroke, the doctor said. Not fatal, but debilitating. He recovered partially, enough to move, to speak, to continue existing, but something fundamental had broken. The businesses were transferred to managers. The investments were moved to trustees. And the patriarch became a spectator in his own life. One afternoon that summer, the housekeeper found him in the conservatory, the same spot where the matriarch had cried, where she'd later admitted building her own cage. He was staring at plants that were no longer being carefully tended, that had begun growing wild in ways the original landscape architect would have considered failures.
It's all still here, he said.
The house.
The grounds.
Everything I built. The housekeeper waited. But they're not, he continued quietly. My wife. My children. The family this was supposed to protect. He looked at her then, and she saw something she'd never seen in 27 years of working for him. Awareness. Not just of what had happened, but of his role in it. I won, he said. Society accepted me. The house proved what I wanted it to prove. But I can't remember now why that mattered so much. Why it was worth more than. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The patriarch died in 1905. In his sleep, in the library, surrounded by the books he'd bought to look impressive but never read. The funeral was well attended. He was still a prominent figure in business and society. But Helena didn't come. The son didn't respond. And when the estate was settled, both children declined their inheritance. Helena wrote, I want nothing from that house. Let someone else pay the cost of maintaining it. The son wrote simply, burn it or sell it. I don't care which. Just remove my name from anything connected to it. The mansion was sold within 6 months to a hotel developer who saw profit in converting a private palace into luxury accommodations. The staff were dismissed with severance. The furniture was auctioned. The family portraits were scattered to relatives who displayed them out of obligation rather than sentiment. And the house that was built to prove belonging, to force acceptance, to create a legacy, became exactly what it had always been underneath the performance. Real estate. A commodity. A structure with no meaning beyond its market value. The grand ballroom where Helena had performed became a dining hall. The library where the patriarch had collapsed became a reading room for strangers. The conservatory where the matriarch had broken became a breakfast room. And the rooms where a family had slowly suffocated under the weight of their own ambitions became hotel suites where guests stayed for a night and never thought about who had suffered there before them. The mansion survived. The family did not. And the cost of that survival was measured not in dollars or maintenance, but in the quiet destruction of everyone who'd ever tried to make it feel like home. The mansion that destroyed a family still stands today. Not as a home. It stopped being that in 1876, the moment the family moved in. Not as a hotel. That venture lasted only 15 years before failing in 1920. But as something stranger, something the patriarch never could have predicted. A museum. A monument to Gilded Age excess. A perfectly preserved example of how America's wealthiest families lived during the era when money was worshipped and suffering was wallpapered over with marble and gold. Visitors come by the thousands every year. They walk through the ballroom where Helena performed for society while dying inside. They admire the library where the patriarch collapsed, finally understanding what he destroyed. They photograph the conservatory where the matriarch admitted she'd built her own cage. And they leave thinking they've witnessed elegance. They haven't. They've witnessed a crime scene. But the evidence has been carefully curated to look like history. The tour guides, well-meaning, knowledgeable about architecture and period details, tell stories about construction costs, imported materials, the prominent families who attended events here. They mention the patriarch as a successful industrialist. They note the matriarch as an accomplished hostess. They reference Helena's advantageous marriage, without explaining what that phrase actually meant. They don't mention the son at all. He's been edited out of the official narrative, erased as thoroughly as he tried to erase himself. What the tour guides don't say, what they don't know because it's not in the approved script, is that this house was never about architecture. It was about desperation, disguised as ambition. About a family who tried to buy belonging and purchase their own destruction instead. About rooms designed not for living but for being judged. About what happens when you sacrifice everything real to maintain something that was always an illusion. The current curator, a woman who's spent 15 years managing the mansion's preservation, knows some of this. She's read the letters that survived, the diaries, the staff testimonies that weren't published but were archived. In a rare, unguarded moment, she admitted, "This house is treated as a triumph of Gilded Age design. But every time I walk through it, all I can think is, someone suffered here. Multiple people. For decades. And we've turned that suffering into a tourist attraction." She paused, then added, "Sometimes visitors ask me if the house is haunted. I tell them no. But that's not exactly true. It's not haunted by ghosts, it's haunted by choices. And those are harder to exorcise. Because the mansion preserves everything except the truth. The ballroom is maintained exactly as it appeared in 1880, chandeliers polished, floors gleaming, walls perfect. But no one mentions that by 1890, it was closed off and used, a monument to parties that had stopped mattering. The bedrooms are presented as examples of Gilded Age luxury, canopy beds, imported furniture, silk curtains. But no one mentions that Helena rarely slept in hers, that the matriarch walked the halls at night unable to rest, that the patriarch eventually abandoned his for a chair in the library. The dining room is staged with elaborate place settings, crystal, china, silverware arranged with museum precision. But no one mentions that the family stopped eating together, that meals became performances of functionality rather than gatherings of connection. The house tells the story it once told. Success. Elegance. American achievement. It buries the story that actually happened. Isolation. Performance. Quiet destruction. And most visitors never question the narrative. They see the mansion as something to aspire to, a level of wealth and sophistication that represents achievement. They don't see it as a warning. But some visitors feel it. The ones who walk through the halls and sense something off. Who stand in the ballroom and feel inexplicably sad. Who look at the perfectly arranged rooms and think, this doesn't feel like a home. They usually dismiss the feeling, attribute it to the museum atmosphere, the roped-off spaces, the do-not-touch signs. But a few, the ones who pay attention, who read between the lines of the placards, who notice what's not being said, leave understanding what they've actually witnessed. Not a palace. A trap that looks like one. In 2019, a researcher studying Gilded Age families was granted access to the mansion's archives, documents not available to the public. She found Helena's letter, the one she'd carried for 33 years. She found the matriarch's personal correspondence, letters to friends that were never sent, admitting, "I don't know who I am anymore beyond what this house requires me to be." She found financial records showing the patriarch had considered selling the mansion multiple times after 1895 but couldn't, because admitting the house was a burden would mean admitting the entire project had failed. And she found something else. A letter from the son to a friend, written in 1910, 5 years after his father's death. People ask why I rejected my inheritance. They think I was punishing my father or making some political statement about wealth inequality. The truth is simpler and sadder. I couldn't inherit that house without inheriting what it did to us. And I'd rather have nothing than carry that weight. The researcher tried to publish these findings. The mansion's board of directors blocked it.
Too negative, they said.
Would impact tourism revenue. Wasn't in line with the mansion's brand as a celebration of Gilded Age achievement. So the letters remain in the archives, available to researchers who know to ask, but never part of the official story. Because the mansion has learned to protect itself, not through silence anymore, but through selective storytelling. It survived the family by becoming a hotel. It survived the hotel by becoming a museum. And it survives as a museum by pretending the cost of its existence was only financial. But there are moments, rare, brief, impossible to schedule, when the truth breaks through. A maintenance worker, alone in the building after hours, described walking through the closed sections, rooms not included in the public tour, and feeling overwhelming sadness. Not scary, he clarified. Just sad. Like the walls remember something they're not allowed to talk about. A night security guard reported hearing sounds he couldn't explain. Not footsteps or voices, but something harder to describe. It sounds like absence, he said. Like the echo of people who aren't there anymore. I know that doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense. Because this house has always been about absence. Absence of genuine connection. Absence of vulnerability. Absence of the love that was supposed to make all the marble and crystal worthwhile. The mansion survived everyone who built it, everyone who suffered in it, everyone who tried to escape it. It outlasted the family's name, their fortune, their social position. It exists now as a monument to American ambition, carefully preserved, meticulously maintained, eternally public. But monuments are for things we've buried. And this house is the grave of a family who died trying to prove they deserve to be loved by people who were never going to love them anyway. Today, as the sun sets and the last tourists leave, as the lights are dimmed and the doors are locked, the mansion stands exactly as the patriarch designed it.
Perfect.
Imposing. Impossible to ignore. A palace that proved everything except what mattered. Because the patriarch wanted to build something that would last forever. And he did. But what survived wasn't his family, or his legacy, or the acceptance he craved. What survived was the trap itself. Still beautiful. Still admired. Still standing as proof that some victories cost more than defeat ever could. The house that destroyed a family didn't fall. It was never meant to. It was built to endure, no matter what it had to consume to keep standing. And so it remains. A monument to the question every visitor should ask but rarely does. What's the point of building something that outlasts everyone who made it worth building? The mansion has no answer. It never did. It just stands there, waiting for the next generation of visitors who will walk through its halls, admire its beauty, and never realize they're touring the scene of a crime that was never prosecuted because the weapon was made of marble and the victims died over decades instead of moments. Some houses shelter families. Some houses destroy them. And some houses like this one, do both. They protect you from the outside world, while consuming you from within. They give you everything society says you should want. And they take everything that actually makes life worth living. The patriarch built a palace to prove he belonged. He succeeded. And the palace outlived him by a century. But if you listen carefully, if you stand in those perfectly preserved rooms and pay attention to what you feel instead of what you see, you'll understand what every wall, every chandelier, every piece of imported marble has been trying to tell us since 1876. Belonging is not something you can build. It's something you destroy when you try.